tricky business. Okay. We're good? Okay. So I think we'll get started. Just welcoming our in-person audience as well as our audience online. My name is Jody Robinson, and I'm the Vice President of QAHN. And I've been asked to welcome you and thank you for your attendance here today, as well as everyone who's watching us online for the film festival. It's exciting. This is our first time that we've done this format, so I'm really looking forward to it. Just a little brief introduction of QAHN. So QAHN is the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve and promote the history, heritage, and culture of Quebec, and in particular, Quebec's English-speaking communities across the province. And you're welcome to become a member of QAHN, and membership is open to everyone, including community groups and heritage organizations, so you can always check on our website at quahn.org for more information about us and about becoming a member. Now I'm going to pass it over to Heather Darch, a project manager, and she's going to introduce and launch the film festival.
Great, thank you, Jody. And I'll add my words of welcome to everyone as well, to you here at the Uplands Cultural Centre at the Lennoxville end of Sherbrooke, and to you online as well. Thank you for joining us on Facebook Live. You'll hear a bit of noise in the background for a few minutes as people take off their coats and come and sit down, but it's all okay, we're under control. I'd like to also say hello to another project director who's here, Glenn Patterson. He keeps everything running for us in person and online with all of the tech. So you won't see Glenn on camera, but he's there in the background. Glenn is in our hearts today, for sure, keeping the show underway. So this is called the Scandal Makers series, and it really began back in COVID time in 2020. Our executive director, Matthew Farfan, who always has his thinking cap on as to how QAHN can move its mission forward, had the idea that we should probably focus a little more on the heritage cemeteries that lie in the Eastern Townships. There are so many of them that lie neglected and unattended, or they're perhaps attached to a church that is now closed, or a church that is on the brink of closing. So what do we do with all these sites that are in peril? And by in peril, I mean they are exposed to the elements, the stones have fallen over, they run the risk of vandalism because there's no one watching them, and we're losing the information that is on the stones. Even people are stealing stones to put in their gardens and make nice pathways. And unfortunately, we know that some sites have been completely destroyed because farmers see that it's an abandoned site on their property and it's plowed under. So we have many sites that dot the Eastern Townships, and actually right across Quebec, in fact. And a lot of these sites represent the English-speaking community. And QAHN's mission is to protect the history and heritage of all history in Quebec, but in particular of the English-speaking communities. And so what's happening when these communities start disappearing? The families no longer exist, or they're very thinly represented. We have these sites that represent the early history of the settlements of these regions, and the early farmers, the people who built up communities, and we need to do something to remind our communities that they're important parts of the history of our province. So on to the cemeteries I went. Matthew suggested taking a cell phone, perhaps doing a shaky cam kind of video. We got a bit better at that. I brought my son, Thomas Gasser, with me, and we set up a tripod and a camera, and away we went. And started talking about some of the interesting characters that were buried in Missisquoi County to start with. And it turned out a lot of the characters we were talking about were actually characters. They bent the law, they caused scandals in their own communities at the time, or even had interesting or unusual deaths. So the name Scandal Makers came out of the first season. And we continued on with the Scandal Makers 2 in again in the townships, featuring other speakers and using other historical societies. And now we're in season 3, and we went beyond the Eastern Townships into the Mauricie, Centre de Québec region as well. So without further delay, we're going to get going on our Series 3 Scandal Makers. And the goal is always to remind people that these are a collection of stones, and the stones have stories with them, and they're worth protecting. So I'll pass it over to Glenn, and on away we go with our first series from season 3. And after each film, I'll invite people to our movie stars to come up and speak, or else I'll give you a bit of background on some of the series, because we're going to look at series 1 and 2 as well. All right, here we go.
So I'm Julie Miller, and I work for the English community organization CASE in the Mauricie and Centre Québec, and I'm here with my friend today.
François Roy from Nicolette. I was born not so far from here, right across the street in the Nicolette Hospital.
And you're a historian.
A long time ago.
That was a very long time ago.
I'm an artifact.
An artifact, but not as long ago as Canelm Connor Chandler.
Of course, when I was a kid, I used to hear about Chandler because his cemetery was still here. Part of his domain was here. The ruins of his manor were here. And so he was part of the local history, but still it was marginal because there was no, except for some material remnants, there was nothing left to remind us of the Anglophone presence in Nicolette.
And that's what we're doing here today. We are in the old English Protestant cemetery, which is surrounded by these beautiful, really old trees, old pines, old maples, about 200 years old. And we're in the cemetery, which holds just a few stones, but there was once 90 or more people buried here. Once, I say once, there still are. The stones are gone. And we're right beside the grave of Seigneur Chandler, Ken Chandler, who bought the Nicolette Seigneurie in 1821. And it was quite a scandalous thing. There's 2 scandals actually associated with him. One during his lifetime and one decades after he died. But let's talk about the one during his lifetime. And what was the scandal?
The scandal was that he got in trouble with the local rector of the parish.
He got in trouble. That's a scandal. The scandal was that he was Protestant. He was the first Protestant seigneur in Nicolette.
Because he was a Protestant, he had problems with the local rector, who was Abbé Rimbaud. And Abbé Rimbaud was in a very uncomfortable position regarding the British power in Lower Canada, because as a priest he was a loyalist. Of course, he was loyal to the British crown because it was given by God. This is the order that was God's will to be in a British regime. But on the other hand, he was not very open to share the religious activities with the Protestants.
To share, he was terrified of the Protestants. Curé Rimbaud. He was really scared about it. So the whole thing started with a dispute shortly after Chandler arrived. And it's very well known in French circles. It's called La Querelle du Pain Béni, which I would call the infamous dispute of the Holy Host. And what happened was there were no, Chandler arrived 1821, 1822 with his wife, Jane Grant. They had one child, one daughter. And Mrs. Chandler, the seigneur's wife, turned up at the Catholic Church for communion. And there was a traditional bench for the seigneur in the church, and she went to sit in that place of honor and expected to be served communion. And Curé Rimbaud walked right past her. know. So she went home, told her husband, and he thought, well, it must have been a mistake, Jane. Don't get all riled up. Don't be silly. Go back next Sunday. So she did. And Curé Rimbaud walked right past her a second time because she was a Protestant heretic. Anyway, so Chandler wrote letters to the bishop and so on, and it was a serious dispute.
Of course, at the scale of this small community, it was a major dispute. But you must remember that Rimbaud was a tough guy.
Yeah. Oh, he was.
Jean Rimbaud was a priest at the outbreak of the French Revolution in France. He refused to swear allegiance to the king of to the new republic, to the new constitution of France. So he was considered as a prêtre réfractaire, refractory priest. And for these guys, they were really in danger during the time of the French Revolution. And happily for him, there was a sort of underground railroad to make them escape. These prêtres réfractaires, there was a way out of France through a sort of a secret network.
Through Belgium and England.
Through Duché de Brabant. That was not called really Belgium then. It was the Duché de Brabant, and then they could turn right to Holland or go straight ahead in Great Britain. So the King of England was stuck with a load of French priests, and they were all Catholics, and he was a keeper of the Anglican faith. But the Bishop of Quebec was out of priests. There was a growing population in the countryside of Lower Canada, and there was a lack of priests, of rectors for all these parishes. So about 50 of the prêtres réfractaires came to Canada. And the concentration was in the Trois-Rivières area. It was called La Petite France because there were so many French priests coming to the Canadian population. Because don't forget that, of course, there were people here French-speaking, but they were not French. They were born in Canada. They were under the British regime. Like we say on our license plate, je me souviens que né sous le lys, j'ai grandi sous la rose. I remember that born under the lily, I grew up under the rose. So they were living and sometimes fighting, but it was at the Parliament. There was a sort of life here that was not like in France, and people here were very glad to be out of France for the revolution, because the revolution here had a very bad reputation.
So he was someone who was really holding on to his faith, and yes. He was a tough guy. So there was this conflict in Nicolette between Chandler and Rimbaud. We had the English-French, we had the Protestant-Catholic, which was the biggest thing. But an interesting dynamic, too, was that Rimbaud wasn't born here and Chandler was.
Of course, you're proud of that. You're very proud of that.
I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, get it.
It's interesting.
Okay.
He was a Canadian-born Seigneur, Chandler. So there was this conflict, and Rimbaud was not going to budge at all. And I don't know that Chandler's wife was trying to make a political statement. I think she just actually wanted to have communion. There were no Protestant priests around.
It was the same God.
That's it. But Rimbaud did not see it that way. So Chandler finally decided, I'm going to build my own church, which he did right here where we're standing. Right here, his manor house was further on. He built it. There were, I think, about 16 donors from Nicolette and Baie-du-Fèvre, and most of the money came from Chandler himself and from his young son-in-law, Thomas Trigg, who was also buried in this cemetery. And that's it. And this really upset Rimbaud. He was extremely upset. He was upset to the point where he thought, am I going to forbid Catholic workers from working on building this heretic building? To that point. Also, once the church was built, he worried that Catholic children would be drawn into Sunday school. He thought that was a terrible thing. And he also banned all Catholics from getting anywhere near a funeral cortege or in the cemetery. I didn't quite get that. It's a bit strange. But there was a real conflict between Chandler and Rimbaud. And Chandler just said, okay, I'll build my own church. And it was called, what was it called? St. Bartholomew's.
St. Barthélemy.
St. Bartholomew's Anglican Church. And I built it in 1824, and it was torn down in 1916. So Chandler died in 1850. His daughter was married to Thomas Trigg. They inherited the seigneurie. They lived here and died here as well. And their descendants at that point were starting to move away. The English Protestant community, because there was an English Catholic community in the area as well, but the English Protestant community started to move away and disperse, and the church was really not being kept up, so it had to be sold, and it was torn down in 1916. And the stone was sold for...
L'École Normale, who opened in 1924 and who's been demolished, that's been demolished in 1966 because of the arduous soil of Nicolette.
Well, there was that big landslide, that destroyed so much
There's
of the
been
town.
a landslide in 55, but in 66, even if the École Normale was away from the site of the landscape, of the land, the glissement terrain, landslide. Landslide. Of course, they had problems with the soil, and it's been demolished in 1966.
We're getting to this grave site and what happened, the scandal after he died, which was about 70 years after he's died, when the church was torn down, because he was buried underneath the church, which was standing right here. So what to do with his body? What to do with his remains? Well, his body, 70 years later, his remains. And there was a big hullabaloo of what to do, what shall we do? A hullabaloo.
A hullabaloo.
A big kerfuffle.
Okay.
a big
A Luftballon.
A big upset. There was his grandsons, Arthur and Henry Trigg, and their aunt, Thomas Trigg's sister, Aunt Lizzie. So Aunt Lizzie Trigg was writing letters back and forth to all the bishops and everything. Like, what shall we do to protect his remains? Because there was no church here anymore, and what should we do? He was the founder of a dynasty, or their ancestor. So I think it was her idea to pour concrete over it. Let's just encase his remains in a nice concrete tomb, and it'll last forever. Which, as we can see now, it isn't lasting forever. In fact, I think it was here several months ago, and it looks worse now than it did even then. And it looks a bit Victorian Gothic, too. It's covered with moss, it's chipped away. And one thing that's really sad is that his name is inscribed in stone on the end, but it's the end that's facing this hedge. And you can't even see who it is, who it was.
Of course, yes, it's a sort of disgrace for the heritage, the material heritage. But you should notice that when Chandler died in 1850, it was the very end of the seigneurial regime. He was the last landlord, because in 1855 the seigneurial regime was torn down, replaced by the municipal regime. There was there's been a sort of compensation for the landlord families, but land owning was over in Lower Canada.
Yeah, but that was the start of it. I think it took decades, because his son inherited the property. So
yes.
Thomas Trigg was still the seigneur, and his son Arthur was still the seigneur in 1916. Then Arthur was starting to get reparations in exchange for land. So that's another story too. We could just tell stories forever about Nicolette, couldn't we?
This is what we do now.
This is what we do. This
yes.
is what we do. But this is such a beautiful location to tell them in, isn't it?
Yes, and it was even better before these buildings here, because there was a beautiful view on the Nicolette River. And now it's over. You have these buildings. You have this sort of gate and no. I prefer the way it was before, because it was really great. They'd done the same thing anyway with the Catholic cemetery, because there was an outlook on the river not so long ago, but now you have bungalows here, because people wanted to build there and have a look on the river, and now they have it,
It's still a beautiful spot with all these old trees. So thanks a lot for joining me, Nicolette, to talk about Chandler and Rimbaud.
It was my pleasure. On behalf of Jean Rimbaud from Orléans, France, prêtre réfractaire.
On behalf of Ken Chandler, English Protestant seigneur of Nicolette.
Born in Lower Canada. Got it. Trinity College, King's College,
You're such a snob.
Yeah.
U of T. U of T. Mais au football, ils sont bons au hockey.
François, arrête. S'il vous plaît.
Shut up.
Clap, sync.
Where is it? Oh, well, it doesn't exist anymore. She gave me a bunch of articles about it being torn down. She says, but the cemetery, you just go here, here, and here. It's right near the Catholic cemetery. So, I'm walking around and I'm wandering through the Catholic cemetery, which is very beautiful and also has English Catholic people buried there. I cannot find the cemetery anywhere. I go back to see Marie. Can you tell me the directions again? She gives me the same directions. Okay. So I noticed a big green space, which looked like private property, and I thought, well, I'm going to just wander around on private property. It was a cemetery, and it was, almost completely abandoned. And then I saw Canelm's tomb, and you all saw it. It's so impressive in person to see.
I had the same problem. If it hadn't been for you who arrived at the cemetery first, I never would have found it. And it's very sad. It's at one of those sites that's been terribly neglected, but has a wonderful story to it, and that's exactly what we're trying to do with this series, is to remind people that all these sites and these crumbling stones represent life stories. And Canelm was an interesting character for sure, and an important part of Nicolette's history. So, and I know, I'll pass it back to you because you two have worked on a series together, and you can tell us a little bit about Case's project.
Okay, well, I work for a community organization, CASE MCQ, which is the Centre for Access to Services in English of the Mauricie and the Centre Québec, and our executive director is actually here today, Shannon Keenan, sitting in the back, smiling. Are you smiling, Shannon? Well, it's a young English-speaking organization in the Mauricie and the Centre Québec, and we wanted to explore local history. We didn't know anything about it very much, and I've worked in community radio before. You've worked in radio, but you weren't part of the project originally. And I thought, well, maybe I can do a podcast. Maybe we can talk about local history. One thing led to another, and I was introduced to, well, I'd sort of seen you before. I knew who you were. Everybody knows who François is in Trois-Rivières. I said, could we do a series on English-speaking history in Trois-Rivières? You gave me a list of 28 topics, And we recorded a series called From Burton to Barton, 250 years of English-speaking history in Trois-Rivières and the region. And you want to say any more about the podcast?
I just want to say that there's a coincidence, a great coincidence, from Burton to Barton, because the first Anglo in Trois-Rivières was Governor Ralph Burton, a native of Yorkshire, England. He came with the British Army in 1760. And until recently, we had the beautiful Brian Barton, who was a teacher at the University of Québec. He was, for us, a big surprise. We used to consider the Brits like, monarchists and conservative and close to the Queen and the country. And he was from the Midlands, from a Labour tradition. He was a left-wing economist, Brian Barton. And in Trois-Rivières, he has done a great job as a professor, but also as a volunteer for community organizations. He died recently. So there was a coincidence from Burton to Barton. The title was great. And I think we have done a great job.
Well, we wanted to go beyond stereotypes of the English-speaking community, too. There are certain stereotypes. We wanted to go beyond that with certain characters who are very well known, but also just give a diverse portrait of English-speaking roots in the area.
Thank you very much, you two. I'm going to have you come back again, of course, but take your seats again. And now we're going to jump back into Series 1, starring yours truly, and we'll find out a little bit more about the hedge creeper. All right, we'll take it away.
Hi, I'm Heather Darch, and this is a presentation by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. This is Missisquoi County, Quebec, and it was United Empire Loyalist country. In the 1780s, the first settlers, wishing to remain loyal to Great Britain, were forced to flee the newly formed United States because of their loyalty to the British Crown. And they found refuge here in Missisquoi County, Lower Canada. We may tend to glamorize the memory of the Loyalists and the early settlers of the 1780s and 90s as noble, honorable, hardworking. Unfortunately, though, this was not always the case, and crooks and swindlers, cheaters and liars came too, and settled into this borderland of southwestern Quebec. And so we find in this beautiful part of the Eastern Townships the less respectable citizens of our early history mixed among those noble and loyal citizens. Today they all lie peacefully in the tiny heritage cemeteries that are found across Missisquoi County. This is Mount Pinnacle, Quebec, near Frelighsburg. The mountain fits into the gently rolling landscape and has an elevation of 700 meters. At one time, there was a small community here called North Pinnacle. The first settlement was established around 1796 by United Empire Loyalists. It has been said that North Pinnacle was just a post office in an agricultural setting established for the convenience of a far-spread population. But if you look at the records, the community of North Pinnacle was actually quite active between 1850 and the 1950s. There were farms, a schoolhouse, a carpenter, a carriage maker, and even a cheese factory and a brickyard. It was also home to a hedge creeper. I'll tell you about the funny story, and then perhaps you will know what this unusual 19th century Victorian slang word means. This is the gravestone of Hepzibeth Jenny in the Deming Cemetery. But I'm going to start with the story of Mary Jenny. Let's call her the innocent victim. Mary Jenny was born in 1807. She was the daughter of Loyalists Stephen Jenny and Mary Fuller. Her younger sister Hepzibeth was born in 1810. She is our hedge creeper. Mary Jenny married Harlow Deming in 1826 in the Trinity Anglican Church in Frelighsburg. The records seem to indicate that Harlow and Mary had 5 children. But you have to be careful not to assume when you look at records. Little sister Hepzibeth Jenny moved in with her big sister and brother-in-law in the 1830s, perhaps to assist with the children. But if you look closely at the census record of 1842, there is something pretty interesting going on in the house. All three adults are together with three male children, Myron, Stephen, and Alpheus, and one daughter named Laura. Myron, Stephen, and Laura belong to Harlow and Mary. Little Alpheus belongs to Harlow and Hepzibeth. It seems that Harlow was having children with both sisters around the same time. Oral history in the family says that it must have been an agreed-upon relationship and that all three adults settled into the arrangement. The story has passed down through the local family members over the years, and they even have recorded that this unusual living arrangement was well known in the family and in the community too. Just as an aside, Harlow is listed in the 1842 census on the same page as the counterfeiter Turner Wing and his counterfeiting sons from Cognac Street. In the 1851 census, though, there was a change. There must have been some kind of breakdown in the relationships. Mary is no longer living in North Pinnacle. She's moved away to another community called Stambridge East, and she works as a live-in domestic for an older couple. In 1851, Hepzibeth is living in a separate house on Harlow's farm with two children this time, Alpheus and a new child named Adeline. Harlow is in his own house with two children, Laura and Stephen, and the eldest Myron is 24 and is working and living with an aunt and uncle. Hepzibeth is listed as a farmer, which is really unusual for the time period to see a woman identified in this way. It's not unheard of, but it's still odd. So she's living in a house designated for a higher hand. One has to wonder, though, if Hepzibeth was actually living in the second house or if they were just trying to be respectable for the sake of the census taker. The 1861 census shows another shift in the living arrangements as Harlow and Hepzibeth are living together. She is identified as Hepzibeth Deming, the wife of Harlow. All pretenses are gone. By 1871, Harlow and Hepzibeth are still living together along with their son Alpheus, who by this time is 35 years old. Mary is still in Stambridge East and lives with her daughter Laura and identifies herself as being a laborer and married, even though Harlow and Hepzibeth indicate that they are married. In 1882, Hepzibeth is the widow of Harlow Deming. But strangely, in the census record, she is called Hepzibeth Jenny, not Deming. Maybe the census taker was wise to it all. Mary is still living with her daughter and calls herself the widow of Harlow Deming and his wife while he lived. Harlow died in 1874 and is buried in the Deming site. Hepzibeth died in 1892 and is also buried in the Deming site, but not near Harlow. And Mary died in Mystic, Quebec in 1894 and is buried in Bedford. So, a hedge creeper, as you may have guessed, is a woman, and in this case a sister, who moves in on another woman's husband. Notice there's no 19th century word for a cheating husband. We only imagine the scandal it caused this tiny Protestant community. The heartache and stress it caused Mary, who now had to make her own way in the world as a domestic servant without the financial support of her husband, and the shame it caused the children of Harlow and Mary. Probably the only two who weren't bothered at all were Harlow and the hedge creeper Hepzibeth. Geez, Hepzibeth, not nice. As Harlow and Hepzibeth are living together, she's identified as Hepzibeth.
A blooper at the end. That one was cut off. I had a hard time saying Hepzibeth, believe me. I got it now. But at the time when I first started, it was like, nah, I don't know how many takes. That's an interesting little story. I have to thank Edwina Jenny for the story. And actually, it was her mom, Hope Cotton Jenny, that first told me the tale back 30 years ago. It must be when I first moved into the townships. And Hope was a local historian. And she said, I have a wonderful story to tell you, and told me the story of the interesting arrangement of her family members. Hope believed that it was very mutual and that they all lived together. But when I did some search into the census records, you realize that Mary was forced out of the house, and Harlow and Hepzibeth carried on as they did. And it must have been very hard for Mary to carry on as a domestic because there wasn't, spousal support back in the day. So she had to make her own way in the world. And the two gravestones of Harlow and Hepzibeth are separated about 15 feet from each other, which may suggest that the family wasn't too thrilled with the arrangements either, but that's where she's buried. And the Deming site is up on the pinnacle, and it's looked after by the Missisquoi Historical Society, but again, it's one of those sites that is under threat because the Historical Society itself has no funding to look after it. They do the best they can. I saw there was a question in the back, yes? Yeah, the children of Mary, they ended up marrying other people from the community, but one daughter moved with Mary down into Stambridge East, so she had support of her children, which was lucky. So that's our hedge creeper from season 1, and again, you can find the series on QAHN's YouTube page. So if you want to go back and see others, there's more stories like that. On to the next one. We're going to go into series 2, and this next one is called The Witch.
Quebec's Eastern Townships are haunted by old tales and legends of times past that lurk incomplete or only half remembered in the collective imaginations of families that have lived here for generations. Stories told by parents and grandparents compete for attention with the complex trappings of contemporary life, and more often than not, are lost to memory. But sometimes, if only by chance, an old tale is preserved, taunting us by its paucity of detail to unwrap the riddles of its narrative. I'm Grant Myers from the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, and I am joining you today from the Thompson Cemetery near the forgotten hamlet of New Mexico in the Eastern Townships. This is the reputed burial place of Peggy Green, the Witch of New Mexico Road. Sometime during the 19th century, farmers living in the vicinity of New Mexico Road were dismayed to discover that their cows were no longer giving milk. Guessing that someone or something was stealing the milk, a few of the farmers set a trap and during the night caught a large white hare suckling on their cows. Supernatural forces were clearly at play, and the farmers released the animal, but not before notching its ears. A short time later, an old woman from the community named Peggy Green died, and it was observed at her funeral that the ears were notched in the same way as the captured hare. This confirmed suspicions that all was not as it seemed. A witch had been stealing the milk. Following the death and burial of the old woman, the farmers expected that their cows would start producing again. But this was not the case. Only after they returned to the cemetery and walled in Peggy Green's grave was the offending spell or curse broken, and the cows again began to yield milk. New Mexico, Quebec today is little more than a quiet corner at the intersection of two country roads. In the 1880s, it was a busy agricultural settlement made up of mostly Irish and French Canadian Catholics. New Mexico is still listed and recognized by the Quebec Toponymy Commission. According to the Commission, the community's first settlers were from Mexico, Maine, a farming town at the confluence of the Androscoggin and Swift rivers in the western end of the state. They came to Quebec to take advantage of cheap land and abundant forests. The Thompson Cemetery was the Catholic burying ground for the New Mexico settlement. 33 existing and legible headstones in the Thompson Cemetery, with dates ranging from 1873 to 1994, were recorded during a survey conducted in 2005. Without exception, all recorded stones displayed names of either Irish or French-Canadian origin. But Peggy Green was not among them. If she is buried in the Thompson Cemetery, her grave is, at present, unknown. But what can we make of this story? The elements of the Peggy Green legend are clearly well rooted in the folkloric traditions of the British Isles. As early as the 12th century, a chronicler reported that in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, it was believed that certain old hags would steal milk by turning themselves into hares and suckling on the teats of cows. It was suggested at the time that this belief was ancient. The story of a shape-shifting hare is just one of the ancient traditions related to the milk magic of Celtic peoples. Identified by folklorists as the witch as hare motif, the tale conforms to a more or less constant formula. A large hare is caught suckling the cows and identified as the cause of the poor yield. The hare is maimed or injured in the attempt to escape. A short time later, an old dying woman is observed to have the same injury as a hare and thus discovered as a thief. The origins of this story are more ancient still and rooted in the mythology of pre-Christian Europe. Many of the deities of old Europe were reputed to have shape-shifting powers and supernatural references to a variety of animals, among them the hare. The Norse goddess Freya was said to have employed hares as her train-bearers. The Anglo-Saxon fertility goddess Ostera, her veneration sometimes identified as a pagan precursor to the Christian celebration of Easter, was often depicted with hare's ears. Cupid, the Roman god of love, was also sometimes depicted in the company of hares. With the advent of Christianity, the old gods of pagan Europe became the subject of folklore, existing as compelling yet incomplete vestiges of another time. Among the rural people in parts of the British Isles and elsewhere, creatures of myth lived on as denizens of the other world, and though largely unseen, often complicated the fortunes of those living in this world. The panic fears of black magic and Satan worship that gripped much of Europe during the Protestant Reformation, leading to the witch hunts of the early modern era, stood in stark contrast to the worldview of the Celtic peoples living on the western margins of the continent. As John Seymour points out in Irish Witchcraft and Demonology, published in 1913, in Celtic Ireland, dealings with the unseen were not regarded with such abhorrence, and indeed had the sanction of custom and antiquity. While the inhabitants of the other world, such as fairies, ghosts, and witches, were often mischievous and sometimes malevolent and dangerous, they were nevertheless considered part of the natural order. It was this worldview, a thick stew of Catholic faith and pre-Christian belief, that Irish immigrants brought with them to the New World. We can understand the legend of Peggy Green as more than a folktale from a small rural community. Rather, it should be recognized as an element of ancient tradition spanning at least 2 continents and innumerable centuries to become part of the cultural legacy of Quebec's Eastern Townships.
Well, that day was incredibly cold and windy, and it was rainy. You can't quite tell in the shots but Grant was freezing. So we had a very good day in that particular graveyard. And it's a great story, and I think it's representative of other witch stories that occur in the townships. I know there's one over in Missisquoi County that it happened in Mystic, Quebec. There was the Clapper family who believed that witches lived on Witch Hill on their property, and at midnight on All Hallows Eve, of course, the witches would come riding forth to look for the seventh son of the seventh son and drag him through a keyhole and ride him like a horse up to Witch Hill and tie him to a post, and he would have to watch the witchy incantations all night long before they would release him. And so this story was passed on through the generations, and that's how we find out a lot about the witch stories like this one, is through oral history, because a lot of them aren't actually written down. So the townships does have other Celtic witches out there, and so this was a very good one. And you can read this story again if you'd like to. Grant wrote the full story in Quebec Heritage News in the winter 2019 edition, and you can find it on QAHN's website under the tab of past issues for Quebec Heritage News. And so that's the 2019 issue, and it's a good one. All right, moving along. If there are no questions after each one, we'll just keep moving along, but please feel free to ask questions if you'd like. I forgot to mention that earlier. The next one is, again, from Series 2, and we are going to go and meet the accused in Ways Mills.
Hello, welcome to this presentation of the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. My name is Anne Lédet, and I am a member of the Stansted Historical Society. Here I am in the Eastern Townships in the lovely cemetery of Ways Mills, some 10 kilometers away from the border with the state of Vermont, as the crow flies. This hamlet of Ways Mills takes its name from Daniel Way, born in New Hampshire in 1794. After moving to the Stansted area with his family in 1819, Daniel Way came here and built a woolen mill in 1843 on the banks of our little river that takes its source at the border and runs for a few kilometers in a northerly direction to Lake Massawippi. A village grew around the mill, first called Wayville and then Ways Mills. Daniel Way died in 1875 and is buried in the cemetery. But though the hamlet bears his name, he was not the first settler in this area. One such early settler was Nathaniel Hollister, a man born in Glastonbury, Connecticut, who first moved to Irisburg, Vermont, with wife and children, and then arrived in this neck of the woods about 1808. One of his sons, Harry Hollister, born in 1805, is the reason why I stand here before you today. Sometime in the early 1830s, Harry Hollister acquired farmland upstream from the future site of Daniel Way's woolen mill, and he dammed the river where it ran across his land and built a sawmill and a grist mill. With those two mills, and later on the woolen mill that would be built by Daniel Way, he had the makings of a village, eventually called Ways Mills. For a while, the border between Canada and the United States of America had remained an ill-defined line, far from a tangible reality. For quite a while, there was unhampered, free circulation of people and goods between the two countries. But with time and the signing of the Washington Treaty in 1842, the border was firmed up, and the good old days of freely crossing the line were technically over. Not surprisingly, activities of contraband and other illicit behavior went on the rise. These townships had the reputation of being a nest of counterfeiters. So the hunt for bandits was on. Many residents of Barnston and Stansted townships, like Harry Hollister, had entanglements with the law. In April 1848, several persons were arrested and accused of engaging in counterfeiting American money. Spurious banknotes totaling some $20,000 were found on various premises and allegedly on Harry Hollister's land. A considerable amount of base coin, gold and silver, was also discovered, consisting of quarter eagles, Mexican dollars, and American half dollars, together with the implements used in coining, among which were several dies and a machine for stamping coin called the Big Bogus. Harry Hollister was arrested and imprisoned in the Sherbrooke jail to await trial. The Stansted Journal reported that the honest and law-abiding citizens of Barnston, and there were many such, would rejoice at the breaking up of the haunts of the desperate and lawless men who had long made that township a reproach. Harry Hollister's trial took place in August 1848. Well, the court concluded that the instruments found in the possession of the prisoner were not designed exclusively for counterfeiting, but were often used by machinists for lawful purposes, and that the prisoner himself, Harry Hollister, was a machinist. The jury was instructed to render a verdict of not guilty, which they accordingly did. After 4 months in jail, Harry Hollister was a free man. He was found to be an honest man after all. He must have read the proverb of the Bible, "A good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver and gold." Harry Hollister and his friend Daniel Way were indeed esteemed citizens who would run their mills and work together for their fledgling community for many years. Harry Hollister passed away on August 28, 1857, at the young age of 52. He is buried right here. Following Harry's passing, his wife, Mary Ann, conveyed the farm to her son-in-law. He kept the farm, but parted with the mills in 1864. The sawmill was then acquired by Adam Kramer, and his son, Willis Kramer, would operate the mill until his death in 1952. To this day, the older residents of Ways Mills fondly remember swimming, when they were kids, in the pool created by the dam of the sawmill. What fun they had! The dam was since dismantled, and today the river flows freely towards the hamlet of Ways Mills before heading towards beautiful Lake Massawippi.
Anne Ledet is actually a judge in the Court of Administration in Montreal. So she was very keen to follow this story through. And I asked her, do you really think he was a machinist or a counterfeiter? And she wouldn't tell me. So she had to trust in the judgment of the time. The counterfeiting trend was very popular in the Eastern Townships. And there are many stories of counterfeiting. In fact, in Dunham, Dunham, Quebec, it was the largest center for counterfeiting in North America from 1800 to 1830, before the administration, police forces in Montreal came to Dunham and broke up the counterfeiting rings. There were quite a few rings, and they were combative rings as well. And families would fight families for control of what was called Cognac Street. So they produce coinage and they produce paper money on different banks throughout the United States, as far down as into Louisiana. They smuggled the plates and the goods and the coins across the border, and women were just as involved as the men. So for more information about Cognac Street, you can find that online on QAHN's, through QAHN's Townshippers magazine. I think it's called, Matthew? And you can also find more about Way's Mills and Anne's story. She has an article online called The Way We Were, and it's an interesting story about the history of Way's Mills. And she and her husband Serge are very keen on history, and they actually live at the site of the former sawmill in Way's Mills, and is very keen on protecting the cemetery that's just down the road from them. And it's well taken care of at the moment, but you see in the background there were stones leaning forward. Even Harry Hollister's gravestone lies flat in the ground, and we had to clear it away, cut it away, dig it out, because you couldn't read it. So even sites that have a small cemetery committee looking after them find that they are struggling to keep up with the sites. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes, go ahead.
In all those old cemeteries, the name on the tombstone are disappearing. Do you have like kind of survey that you can take pictures of each of them to keep the names and before it disappears? Do you have something like that in your association?
So I'll repeat the question so that the folks online can hear. This woman said a lot of the gravestones, the names are disappearing, and what can we do about it? Is there a survey? Is there an inventory? Has QAHN done anything about it? And the answer is yes. And perhaps, Matthew, I don't know if you can answer this a little more. It was a project a few years ago when a lot of the historical societies went out into graveyards to do an assessment about them, what shape they were in, where they were located. Some of them weren't even identified on maps. And the historical societies in the regions have been writing down names and recording the stones, taking photographs. And there's certainly larger sites like Find a Grave website that records the information for recording that stone information becomes the property of big sites like Find a Grave, but a lot of the historical societies themselves do have the collections in their own archives. I believe QAHN still has all those records from that particular project. It was maybe done in 2005. It's been quite a while, but it's probably time for an upgrade and a reassessment. But we hope that the local cemeteries, of course, are being looked after by local historical societies, but that's not always the case. So there's probably holes that need to be filled in that kind of preservation. You're welcome. Is there any others? Yes.
Hi. Thank you for today, and thank you for everybody who's participated in these very informative videos. I have a question for Francois Bois. I think it's for Francois, maybe for Julie. Regarding the Chandler tomb and that site in Nicolette, which I didn't know existed, is there somebody looking after that property at all? I know the tomb itself seems to be in bad disrepair, but is the site itself the responsibility of anyone in Nicolette?
I'll ask Francois to come up here, and I'll just repeat the question. The question was regarding Colum Chandler's, what's his name? Kenelm Connor Chandler's gravestone and that particular site in Nicolette. And so Francois will answer the question if someone's actually taking care of it.
The body of Chandler was translated or sent in Trois-Rivières because at the Anglican Church in Trois-Rivières, you now have on the main wall an inscription, a beautiful plaque in bronze, I think, and it talks about his lifetime and about his family, the Trigg, his descendants. But in Nicolette, the cemetery was, the responsibility for the cemetery was the Anglican diocese, I suppose. And nothing really happened. In Trois-Rivières, there's been a deal between the Anglican diocese and the city of Trois-Rivières. Now we have different works to keep in good shape the Anglican cemetery in Trois-Rivières, which is really great. You're talking about inscription. We have James Sinclair, who was at Culloden. It's written on the tombstone. He was with the Duke of Cumberland in Culloden. He was in Lewisburg and in Quebec with the illustrious Wolfe, they say. And he died in Trois-Rivières. He was very aged. So in Trois-Rivières, there's a deal. And there's a way to keep in good shape the cemetery. But in Nicolette, it's been let down, seems like. I was the first person to be scandalized when I saw that they built on the very edge of the cemetery, all this part that was open on the Nicolette River. Now you cannot see. It's an enclave now. It's very close on all sides.
The property itself, though, is the property of the Anglican Church. It remains part of the diocese holdings.
I don't know who's the owner, but it used to be the diocese.
Julie, come on up. The question was, does the Anglican Church own it? Is the diocese in charge? So Julie, just take the mic and go ahead.
That's a great question, Dwayne, and it's of concern. When the church was knocked down and the Anglican Church, the plaque was removed to the Anglican Church in Trois-Rivières, but Canelm, Connor, Chandler's remained there. It's the plaque that was in the church. It was sold, it was given to the Grey Nuns for them to take care. They would have the land, because there was extensive lands, and they, in exchange, would take care of the cemetery in perpetuity. And it's not abandoned in the sense that there's weeds everywhere and you have to go through a jungle to find it. It is abandoned in the sense that no one's taking care of the stones, but someone's mowing it, and there is a fence around part of it. So I think as the Grey Nuns die out as well, they're very old themselves. There's no Grey Nuns in Nicolette particularly anymore. So we have to see what's going to happen. But there's been some interest with this project now with the town of Nicolette, because they invited us, the city invited us to do a little conference at the library about English-speaking history, and everyone was like, oh, wow, we didn't know, we had no idea. And then they've invited us to come back and do a conference in the summer in the cemetery.
I think that's key, and congratulate you for the effort to educate the municipality. Because in the case of many of these small family cemeteries, called them Protestant or whatever, they're really family cemeteries, unattached to a kind of church structure, their future is very uncertain. Unless there is a committee of volunteers with monies invested somehow to keep up with the cost of maintaining these sites, they are going to disappear. This concept of in perpetuity, which is a very strange Protestant optimistic view from 200 years ago, that all these communities were going to exist and look after each other's dead from generation to generation, is proving to be wishful thinking. So I think that emphasizing the historic nature and the cultural nature of these sites to municipalities is exceedingly important now, or we will actually lose all this information in the future. There are many sites throughout the townships and in rural parts of probably across the country, but I know more familiar with Quebec, in this region in particular, without some acknowledgement and support by the municipal authorities and recognition of their historic value. I think the future is very dim for these sites.
Should I resume quickly what he said?
Yeah. Oh, well.
It made some really great points, Dwayne, about the importance of sensitizing the municipalities and the old concept of taking care of cemeteries in perpetuity just doesn't work in the long term, and there's no families there to take care of the cemetery, which is absolutely correct. I'm just trying to resume it quickly because I wanted to add, it's really interesting in Nicolette. There is a Centre Régional d'Archives, and it's part of the local seminary, which is now the police academy, but the archives were kept there. And there was a retired priest what was his name? Denis Fréchette. How could I forget his name? He was so interested in this Protestant church that he transcribed the church registry by hand and had it all typed out, and he added an annex with all the notes of the families and so on, and that's one of our main sources. He's unfortunately passed away, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic. But just an example of what happens when there's a citizen who recognizes the historic value, as you were saying, of not just for the families but for the entire community, and so.
What did it mean in the end of the 1700s, 1800s to have a seigneurie, and what happened after when that no longer existed?
Okay, that's a good question. That's a big question. So, I'll answer a little bit if you just let me keep going. So the question is, what did it mean to be a seigneur in the 1800s? And then what happened when the laws ended it and the municipalities were founded? You said that in the video, you said that the municipalities were founded. Was 1855 the law or something like that?
Le régime municipal, the municipal regime dates back to 1855. Back then, all lands were the property of the state, of the government. But what they call les rentes seigneuriales, what you had to pay to le seigneur, it remained for a couple of decades. So some people had to pay again and again and again until the extinction of this deal they had. Sometimes, I should say, in the 20th century, it went as far as the 20th century for le versement des rentes seigneuriales.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really long transitional process because the last seigneur was not actually Kenelm Connor Chandler. It was his grandson who was. There were two of them. There was Arthur and Henry. Arthur sold to Henry. It was Henry. He was the actual one. He was still collecting seigneurial rents in 1910. Were the people in the property renters? Yes. And it was a bit of a gray zone. I mean, I'm not an expert in the transition to municipalities, but they were still paying rents because in the archives, there's all these official documents dating from, I think it's 1915, 1916, where they go through all the lots, and Arthur Chandler, Arthur Trigg was his name, has to go and say how much rent he's still collecting from these people. And many of them he's not still collecting rents from, but some of them he is. And then when you talk about the formation of the municipalities, I heard that it was as late as the 60s or the 70s that some municipalities were still paying back the loan that it had to be taken out to buy back the seigneurial properties. So it's an interesting subject in its own. But to go back to the first part of your question, what did it mean to be a seigneur in the 1800s? Once again, that's not my specialty, but Kenelm Connor Chandler, it's so interesting. This project, it's just so interesting. You start digging a little bit, and you don't only find old bones. You find all these old stories, and he was such an interesting person. He had been a military man, and he was actually illegitimate. And he was born out of wedlock, and many of them were. It's very surprising, but anyway. And he wanted to have a farm. That's what he wanted. He wanted to get out of the military and cultivate cabbage and roses and maybe pineapples and this sort of thing.
He was barrack master for the English army.
Yeah, he was
before buying the seigneurie.
Yeah, so there's a long story which I won't go into because I have to stop. But it meant so much for him to be part of that, and I think he might have come into it a bit innocently, not realizing the conflict that would exist between the Protestant and the Catholics. Because the more we look at the history, or the more I look at it, and I understand that there was no conflict between the English and the French. It was between the Protestants and the Catholics. And even then, there was all this intermarriage that was happening. But I don't think Kenelm Sr. really knew what he was getting into when he came to Nicolette. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much, you two. There we go. And you realize how important municipal participation is in the protection of the stones and the sites. The community of Dunham, once they realized they had counterfeiters up on Cognac Street, which is now called Chemin Houdon, it's just unfortunate they changed the name because Cognac was a name for spurious bank bills, for counterfeit money. It was an old slang word, Cognac. Anyway, they have been running bus tours up to the sites to take a look at them, and so starting to take ownership, perhaps, and taking interest. And that's part of the battle is getting community people, and if you can, your council to take interest in the sites. Well, we probably can smell the beautiful creations coming out of the Uplands kitchen. For those of us here, we get to sample some Victorian treats. We're going to have an intermission. For those of you at home, please go grab a coffee, a cup of tea, and join us again in about 15 minutes. We're going to see 2 more of season 3 films, and you'll have a chance to speak with Julie and Francois again. You can meet them out in the reception room as well. So take a stretch, 15 minutes, and we'll be back here again for the second part for our series 3. Well, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to you folks on Facebook. I'm not going to show you what the room looks like. Everyone is still eating delicious squares and little canapes and drinking tea and coffee. We're starting to come back in now, which is great. We're at the Uplands Cultural and Heritage Center in Lennoxville. That's at the Lennoxville end of Sherbrooke in Quebec. And it's a wonderful site, a heritage home, and they've graciously opened their doors to us so that we could run this event about the Scandal Makers and our Season 3 series. I guess, Glenn, we'll just go ahead and we'll let people come back in. We're going to start another film from Series 3, and enjoy this one. And again, it involves our wonderful stars, Julie Miller and Francois Roy, and away we go.
Hi, I'm Julie Miller, and I work for the English community organization CASE in the Mauricie and the Centre Québec. And I'm here in Trois-Rivières on the Rue des Ursulines, corner Sainte-Cécile, with my friend
François Roy from Nicolette, but now I live in Trois-Rivières. I've done all my career in Trois-Rivières, and I'm glad to be with you because I'm the host of here in the old part of the city that must be discovered by many people, I think.
And you're a historian.
I'm an historian. I try to be because...
You are.
Okay, thank you.
You have a great memory.
Great.
So we're here today because down the street just behind us is the oldest Anglican church in Trois-Rivières, St. James Anglican, which is now being converted into a marionette theater and international residency for marionette artists. But from 1760s, it served the English-speaking population of Trois-Rivières. And why are we standing here on a street corner with a road behind us? Well, we're actually standing on the first English cemetery in Trois-Rivières.
Yes. The second one is nearby. It opened in 1808, but here it was a sort of improvisation because, you know, there's been the British conquest, British occupation of Trois-Rivières. They had to live with what they had around them. And before they settled for real, you know, there's been a couple of decades. And the first cemetery was somewhere around here because we don't know exactly. We have to refer to the very old plans of the city.
Yeah, no, well, there's a historian, Daniel Robert, who's located it here. And when we asked him, well, did they dig up the bones when they made the road? What did they do? He says, we really don't know. It's likely that maybe this cemetery had been abandoned by the time they made a road here and paved it. Maybe somebody took the stones. Maybe they removed a layer of remains, but it's quite likely they didn't dig too deeply. So there are the remains of the first English-speaking Protestant community in Trois-Rivières. Anyway, and that would have included soldiers, a lot of soldiers from the Royal American Regiment, maybe from Fraser's Regiment too, but I think some soldiers from Fraser's Regiment were actually Catholic. Well, I was going through the old registries of St. James Anglican Church, and I found the name of the first person buried in the cemetery. So right here, underneath us, he was a soldier from the Swiss, well, he wasn't Swiss actually, from the Royal Americans, which had a lot of Swiss in it. He wasn't Swiss. His name was William Brennan, and he was buried here in 1768. And there would have been a lot of interesting people from the early days of the English presence in Trois-Rivières buried here. A seigneuress from Yamachiche could very likely be buried here. And the person that we want to talk about, who was a slightly scandalous person. So he was the first Anglican priest of St. James Anglican here. And he had a really long name, so I'm going to hand that over to you.
He was not even Anglican.
He was, oh, you what? Well, yes, he was. He wasn't born Anglican. He wasn't born Anglican. He was a convert.
He was born in the center of France, which is not a normal land of immigration.
It's so long. It's Léger Jean-Baptiste.
Léger Jean-Baptiste Noël. Vessière. He was born in the central area of France, around Limoges, which is not a normal land of immigration. Most people were from Normandy or Poitou, and he was from this area, and he came here as a Catholic priest. After that, he turned Récollet, which is a branch of the Franciscan order, and later he became an Anglican minister.
Yeah, so he converted. So that's the scandal. And he was scandalous for actually two reasons. He was scandalous in the French Catholic community, and he was scandalous in the English Protestant community for different reasons. He covered all the bases.
Damn if you do, damn if you don't.
Poor guy. But maybe he felt he was saved because he'd converted. Who knows? But so he was a scandal for the French Catholic because he had converted. I mean, that was just unheard of. That was a terrible thing, right?
You don't say converted. You say that he...
Oh, yeah.
No. Il était un apostat.
Okay.
Convertir is another thing. Convertir can be positive.
He went towards the heretic church.
Apostate, you say?
An apostate, that's it.
An apostate. He was an apostate. He was not only a converted.
Yeah. No, so he was a fallen. He was a fallen man for the Catholics. But he was controversial in the English-speaking community for a different reason.
Because, first of all, he was known to be a libertin, you know. He had an interest in women.
Oh, he had mistresses and he drank a bit.
And after he turned Anglican, he married twice.
Well, that's what you're allowed to do.
Okay, and then he had another problem because he was not familiar with theology. The Franciscans brothers were people, everyday people, taking care of everyday people, you know, in the Catholic hierarchy. But being an Anglican minister, he should have a knowledge of King James Bible, what he was unable to do, and he must have a gentle, a sweet accent and a sweet discourse.
Okay, so maybe he wasn't as familiar as he could have been with the Bible, perhaps, but that wasn't the real scandal. The real scandal was the fact that he butchered the English language. Nobody could understand a thing he said. That's what I think there were complaints.
I butcher the English language. You still talk to me. I mean,
I can
that's
understand.
not a problem. I mean,
no. I think he butchered it to the point where that no one could understand him. I mean, wasn't there a complaint that was formally written by somebody saying that he didn't understand a single word of his sermon, and it was delivered in English?
Yes, and there's been a complaint. Hey, listen, there's been a complaint, against him too. Let's call it the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in England. There's been an official complaint at the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel to say, hey, something's wrong in the new colony of Canada because the ministers are mostly him, but still others were butchering the English language and had no knowledge of the Bible.
So you might wonder, why did the Anglican Church choose to have a French priest if they were mostly serving English speakers? Because they would have also been serving French speakers. There were French Huguenots present, and there were also Swiss Protestants and the Royal Americans. So why did they choose this? This was partly thanks to Governor James Murray. Now, he thought that maybe if the Protestants had a French speaker, they could start slowly converting. Just not making too many ripples, but maybe converting some French Catholics.
Me, an Anglican?
So
are you trying to convince me?
Okay, we're going back to 1760s.
Okay.
All right. I'm not trying to convince you. But James Murray thought it would be a good policy, and it bombed. I think Vessière converted 2 people. He converted 2 people.
Probably his
mistresses.
Probably 2 mistresses.
But I think he was a very unusual person for his time, definitely, and obviously a colorful person. But maybe he's been a bit malaligned or maligned in history because he was a very well-read person. When he died, his library was auctioned off, and Aaron and Ezekiel Hart came, and they were big collectors of books, and apparently he had a lot of books.
He was a neighbor of Aaron Hart.
So he was a neighbor.
Close neighbor and probably a friend, I suppose.
Yeah.
Hart was anyway. He was Jewish, but he had to mix with the Anglophone community because he was himself an Anglophone from New York City, and he was representing the British government here. So.
Yeah. So a very, very interesting beginning for the St. James Anglican Church here, which is one of the oldest Anglican churches in Quebec and in Canada. The first priest was...
An apostle.
No, he was a convert. He was an Anglican, Vessière, and he was buried right under the street somewhere here. It wasn't the street at the time, but he's buried somewhere here in his grave.
He died the same
year. Which I think is sad.
He died the same year as Aaron Hart, his neighbor.
A little known fact.
Okay. I'm here to make you discover something.
I know. I always discover lots of stuff.
That's it.
With you.
1800. The straight 1800. They died.
Vessière.
Yes.
Léger Jean-Baptiste Noël Vessière, first Anglican priest, St. James Anglican Church, Québec. So I'd mentioned that St. James Anglican was a focus of the English-speaking community of Trois-Rivières and of the region. So here we are inside, and as you can see, they're getting ready for renovations to convert it into a marionette theater and a residency for international artists to come and workshop their visual theater pieces. But this is such a beautiful space, and there's a smell to the building, an old smell from the woodwork and from just all the years, the many hundreds of years, really, that the church has stood here. And the walls are covered with plaques, remembering some of the important community leaders, Matthew Bell and his wife, Anne Mackenzie. The plaque of Chandler from Nicolette was brought and put in the wall here. There's a plaque to Bartholomew Gugy. There's a great many plaques, and not to mention there's 2 plaques on the walls remembering the soldiers who gave their lives during World War I and World War II. And we see the family names, Whitehead, Ritchie, Kendall, Vining, Collins, Baptist, Smith, and many other names who are remembered in the community here and who have descendants living here today. So we just wanted to bring you in to take a look at this beautiful space where Léger Jean-Baptiste Noël Vessière would have preached his unintelligible sermons.
Story, isn't it? It makes me laugh every time, and I've seen it many times, of course, and the mumbling minister, or whatever, incomprehensible. And it's a wonderful sight, and we're so lucky that we were able to go inside and see what was happening. I imagine it looks very different now with the floorboards that were all torn up at the time. And so it's a great story. Again, how did you find it? And it was such a detailed story.
This chapel was originally part of the Récollet convent, built in 1742. The British took it in 1760, made it a courthouse, the jail, and later a church. And when the Anglican Bishop of Quebec City offered him to the Catholic Bishop of Trois-Rivières recently to say, we're closing the building, do you want to take it? We can agree on the price. The Catholic bishop said, we're going to pay you back the price you paid in 1760, which means nothing. So it's indeed now a theater. It will be a theater, a place for shows of all kind, and the person responsible for that is called Miller, South Miller. She's from New Brunswick originally. She's an Anglophone. And maybe she's a cousin of Julie, I don't know.
I don't know if you know this, that there's a small Eastern Townships connection to the church in one of the ministers that came after Vessière. His name was Robert Quirk Short, and he was appointed there by Bishop Mountain to look after the congregation. He was a terrible minister as well, and they had nothing but complaints about him. He even had gathered the congregation on one Sunday to witness his flying machine rather than give a sermon. So the church has a reputation for shaky ministers, I think. So.
In their defense, I think that there were some that were solid citizens too. As we look more and more into the history and research more and more, we find different connections. And there was one of the ex-ministers of the Drummondville Anglican Church, St. George's Anglican, I think his name was Wood, Samuel something Wood. Rod Wood. No. Samuel Wood. Anyway, he also was a minister there and had lots of children. And one of the big industrialists in Trois-Rivières, Charles Ross Whitehead, who founded Wabasso Textile and many other textile and paper mills in Trois-Rivières, was a great contributor to that church. And he also took over when they closed St. Bartholomew's in Nicolette. He was the one responsible for dealing with a lot of the paperwork. So.
Any questions from the crowd? I have just a quick one. Plaques that are on the wall, are they going to be staying there? Because it's sort of as there's no cemetery anymore, it's one of the signs that there was a congregation and there were people in the community. And
it's my understanding that yes, the plaques are staying there and that they're no.
You cannot touch a patrimonial building.
Yeah,
it's sacred. It's the double sense. In the double sense, it's sacred. You cannot touch that. You can. What they do now is to preserve, especially the floor, which was crumbling, but it's so old. It's so patrimonial. It's important for both the French and the English community. And I think that Mrs. Miller is taking care of that. And when the Mrs. Miller took care of something, usually it goes very well.
But I think they received funding from the federal government, and they had to respect as much as possible the building.
Thank you very much, you two. That was a great story. We're going to present one more film to you. This is quite a poignant one. It has a bit of scandal, but it's more a reflective story. And this one is called The Grey Nun.
Hi, I'm Julie Miller and I work for the community organization CASE in the Mauricie and the Centre-Québec. And today we're in the Grey Nun Cemetery in Nicolette to visit the grave of Annie Hyland. And Annie was from an English-speaking background. There were, once upon a time, quite a lot of people from Irish families who lived in the area all the way from Nicolette, along the Nicolette River to Bécancour, Saint-Brigitte-des-Sceaux and Drummondville. And Annie herself was born in Saint-Brigitte-des-Sceaux. She lived from 1873 until 1939. And I'd like to tell you her story, and it's not an easy story. But first of all, I'll say that the welcome we've had here has been so touching. We were met by two grey nuns this morning who had decorated Annie's grave with flowers and had a long chat with us about their lives. And the grey nuns are mostly a nursing order, a missionary order as well, but mostly associated with hospitals and playing different roles to support a hospital. Well, there were teachers as well. So about Annie Highland. Annie first caught my attention when I saw a short passage in a local history book in reference to her. And there was a phrase that jumped out at me. And it was, Annie defended the rights of the Indians. I thought, well, what was that about? She lived 1873 to 1939. What was that about? And then suddenly I realized that Annie had spent 35 years of her life associated in one way or another with residential schools on the Blood Reserve in Cardston, Alberta. So I wondered, what was Annie's role there? What brought her out there? And before we go out to Alberta, we're going to go back to St. Brigitte, where Annie was born, the fifth of 8 children, to Farmer Danny. Maybe they called him Danny. His name was Daniel Highland, and his wife Mary White. And Annie was the eldest daughter. And she was a bit different from her sisters and brothers. She had a different childhood anyway, because Daniel's brother, Annie's uncle William, was a businessman in Drummondville, and he and his wife were childless, and they wanted to adopt Annie. They just loved her. So her father wouldn't hear of it. He wouldn't give his daughter away, but he did allow her to divide her time between the farm in St. Brigitte and her uncle's house in Drummondville, which she did. Now, Uncle William was very, very generous, and he always made sure that Annie, from a young child through her adolescence, had her own pocket money. And it seems that she spent it unfailingly on charity. She did everything she could to ease the suffering of the poor, to help them out. And when she was in Drummondville, she and her aunt attended Mass every single day. So with such a level of religious devotion, you'd think that Annie had decided from a very young age that she was going to become a nun. She dreamed of becoming a nun. That's the natural conclusion. But it wasn't like that at all. Annie did not dream of becoming a nun. She loved her freedom and her autonomy too much. She didn't want to marry, but she didn't want to become a nun either. She was vivacious, she had lots of friends, she was very musical, but she was also extremely tender-hearted, compassionate, determined, and she had inherited a fierce work ethic from both her parents on the farm. So she attended the convent school in Drummondville for 6 years, thanks to Uncle William, who paid the tuition, no doubt. But after that, Annie went to Nicolette, where she was apprenticed as a dressmaker. Now, when she was in Nicolette, she would go to and from the workshop, and she would pass the Hôtel Dieu hospital run by the Grey Nuns, and she would stop there and pray every day in the chapel. She'd also visit the wards. And she was extremely touched by all the love and care the Grey Nuns gave to the elderly and to the very sick and feeble. But even then, she did not think about becoming a nun. No, she was going to be independent, she was going to earn some money, and she was going to live with her aunt and uncle and take care of them in their old age and repay the kindnesses that they'd given her. Well, the Bishop of Nicolette, Elphège Gravel, had other ideas, and he set himself the task of converting Annie to the idea of becoming a nun. So she was, of course, Catholic. He didn't have to convert her, but he was going to convince her that she had the vocation. And he had to work really hard for months because she didn't think she had the vocation. She had so many doubts, and he kept reassuring her. And he was tenacious because he knew that the church needed women for their work. They needed teachers, nurses, missionaries, domestics. And he didn't give up. And he won. He convinced her. Annie's decision to enter the novitiate did not cause unanimous joy among her family members, despite the fact that they were a really religious family. Her mother was delighted, but her father was dead set against it. In Annie's own recollections, Daniel said to her, "I will never say yes to this. I cannot see you shut up inside those walls for your entire life. But you must make your own decisions, and you've made your own decision, and I won't be an obstacle to your happiness." So on that day in May of 1893, Annie knelt before her father, and he gave her a traditional, formal, very ancient and significant paternal blessing. He put his hand on her head and he asked God to bless her. And I think this was a gift that Daniel gave her, and not so much because of the blessing, although that was important as well. But it was the fact that he gave it despite his opposition to what she wanted to do. He was respecting her right to choose her own life path. He was respecting her own autonomy. And not all fathers in 1893 were doing this with their daughters or with women in general, you have to remember. So it's somewhat ironic then that in May of 1893, when Annie left for the convent, she had received a gift of autonomy from her father, pretty much for her whole life, and she was now entering an institution where obedience was the number one virtue, and autonomy was really not part of the package. Henceforth, she would have to obey her superiors. By 1901, Annie Hyland, now Sister St. Patrick, found herself on the Immaculate Conception School on the Blood Reserve in Cardston, Alberta. And the school was quite small at first. There were only 28 students, but enrollment began to grow, especially in the 20s, when they built a new school called St. Mary's. And Annie was there for 35 years, all told. The first 17 years, roughly, she was a teacher and the musical director. And for the last 17 years, from about 1920 to 37, she was their nurse. And this is where the dark chapter of Annie Hyland's life starts, her adulthood, much darker than her childhood. And it's dark for two reasons, and in two senses. First of all, because we don't have any of her journals or her letters, so we don't know what her own thoughts, her own experiences, her own feelings were. And secondly, because, of course, Annie spent 35 years as part of the residential school system, which is one of the greatest stains on our country's history. So what did Annie do there? What was her role there? What happened to the young, tender-hearted, vivacious girl who went out there? Did she have misgivings? Did she have doubts? Did she understand the consequences of what was going on in those schools? I'd like to go back to that chapter, or that reference in the old history book I found. Annie defended the rights of the Indians. I'd like to hope that her love of autonomy led to her respecting the autonomy of others, but I just don't know. And a word now about obedience and disobedience back in the day. So for the sisters at that time, obedience was everything. There was a price to pay. You were disciplined if you did not obey your orders. And if you were given a new job, a new task, a new responsibility, it wasn't called that. It was called literally an obedience. So Annie would receive a letter telling her about her new obedience, which would be a new job or responsibility, whatever. And from the 1920s on, in these letters, there was always be a letter, a phrase or two of sympathy for her ill health. But nevertheless, they'd say, you have to obey these orders. Even if you deserve a rest, I'm sorry, you can't have one, you must continue. So there was no way out. And if you look at the wider society back at that time, whistleblowers were not well perceived. I mean, they might still not be well seen today, and they face a really hard life. A case in point is Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, who worked for public health, and he wrote a report on the conditions in residential schools back in 1907. And he demanded reforms so that there would be no unnecessary deaths of children. Well, his superiors didn't like that at all. Within years, his funding was completely cut. He was never able to advance in the public service, and he was eventually forced into retirement. So that's what happened to people who did not obey back in the day. It was very, very difficult. So what do we know about Annie? And what do we know about the school and the years that she spent there? Well, we do know that she was very well liked. And it seems that her memory is well liked as well, because as I said, when we came here, the nuns came out and had beautiful flowers on her grave. Apparently she preferred to live her faith rather than lecture about it. And there's another thing that was very interesting. She was very fond of giving gifts and tokens of her affection to not only her colleagues but her students. And there's an interesting thing in the annals of the Grey Nuns. There's a mention of a student of Annie's who came out to Nicolette after her death. His name was Christopher Shade. And the nuns only say two things about him in the reference. One, he'd converted to Protestantism. And two, he was wearing actually quite a pretty tie pin that had been given to him by Sister St. Patrick. And what we know about the schools themselves is thanks to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. They've gathered information on a lot of the residential schools, and particularly about St. Mary's, so from the 20s on, from the time that Annie was the nurse. So there were reports of severe corporal punishment, specifically of the boys being shut in rooms for days as punishment. In the 1920s, there were reports that teaching was so bad that the federal government finally paid for a teacher's training course for the Grey Nuns in 1924. And in 1926, there was a farm associated with the school, also with the Anglican school on the same reserve, and the boys were said to work like slaves without proper supervision. All in all, in the 35 years that Annie was on the blood reserve in Cardston, there were 25 children who died. And remember, this was when Annie was the nurse. So would she have tended their wounds? Would she have heard them coughing? Because she would have been coughing herself. She had TB and she died of it. And would she have washed and shrouded the bodies of the dead children? Annie's story just brings up so many questions, so many difficult questions. What if she hadn't become a nun? And what was it that made her change her mind about her original life plan? Another question that comes to mind and bothers me is, how can someone who is so obviously tender-hearted and compassionate have been part of the residential school system, which was such a stain on our country's history? She was a nurse. Was she able to help the children? Was she able to alleviate suffering? Or was she helpless? Or worse, did she ever contribute to any deaths? Another question, what power did the nuns have to make complaints? What power did they have within the system to make change? They're all big questions, and I do think it's important to grapple with them as we deal with the legacy of the residential schools so that we can all go forward as a stronger community. And you know that old saying, those who don't know their history are bound to repeat it. So it's really important to grapple with these questions, and I'm grateful to the memory of Annie Highland for opening the door to so many questions. I'd also like to thank the Grey Nuns once again for their incredibly welcoming, warm, friendly reception here in the cemetery. I'd like to thank their archivist, Alcé Pené, who helped me find a lot of information about Annie Highland. And I'd also like to thank the archivists at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation.
So not all stories are easy, and we wanted to end our presentation today with that one, so you would go out into the world thinking about stories like that, and our responsibility to learn more about residential schools and explore our history. So I'll ask Julie to come up again. You may have some questions for her. And this was an interesting cemetery to be in. You can see it was very tidy, it's well cared for, but I believe that there are hardly any Grey Nuns left, and what happens next to the cemetery, I'm not sure. There's maybe some funding still, of course, in the Catholic Church. But so if you have any questions, Julie, how did you find this story in the first place?
Once again, thanks to Marie Pelletier at the Centre d'Archives Régional de Nicolette, du Séminaire de Nicolette. It's a long title anyway. I did go in looking for English-speaking history, and she said, oh, well, you'd want to know about Sainte Brigitte des Sceaux, and that's the municipality, and they made a memory book of their community. Can't quite remember what year, I'm very bad with dates, but somewhere around 2002, and that's where I saw the mention of Annie Highland for the first time, and it's over a period of time. I made contact with Robert Highland, who is now Robert Highland, and he'd written a family history. He knew a little bit about that, but yeah, that's how I found out about Annie.
I thought it was interesting that she died out west, but no, she didn't. Okay, tell me a little bit. She eventually left the residential school? Or?
Yes, so she died in, can't quite remember, bad with dates again, I think 1939, yes, on the eve of the Second World War. And I guess she had had TB for, I think, something like 15 or 20 years. I think she just got to the point where she was really sick, and they brought her back, and she died in Nicolette.
They finally let her be free of her obedience. Yeah, tough life, huh? Yeah, and it's sad. And we had a lovely conversation with the two nuns that were there. That's why we included them at the end, because they were so kind. And I don't know if they know her story, but they're interested to learn more themselves. So, and I don't know where they served, but they are now in Nicolette and living the rest of their lives there. Mm-hmm.
Well, one of them was a nurse. And another one was an administrator in one of the missions in South America. And they explained to me that, once again, they're not a teaching order. So the nuns who were sent off to become teachers had no training. That was not their vocation. That was not what they were called to do, but they were called to obey. But they were really a nursing order, and they could either be nurses or administrators of some sort. Yeah. And just saying, I mean, you did such a great job putting that video together. Thank you so much. And I was watching it, and I hadn't thought about Annie's story for a long time. It just makes me want to cry watching it because of all the questions and the questions it does bring up for me. And, I had no doubt that she, at the beginning of her life, she was such a a truly caring person, a truly compassionate person. And then you think of, best laid plans of mice and men, or, good intentions or whatever. It wasn't just intentions in her case. She was a caring and loving person. And that's not to say that she didn't continue to be. However, she was wrapped up in this system, and which brings together all the, we're talking a lot today about systemic racism versus individual racism, and that whole question is a complicated one.
It is, and thank you so much for telling this story. It's important to tell these kinds of stories. So not all of the scandal makers are fun stories. This was a very thought-provoking one, and I appreciate your time that you gave on this. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. I'm now going to introduce you to Matthew Farfan. He is the Executive Director of QAHN, and he is going to close our our event today. So I'll pass it over to Matthew.
Thank you, Heather. Well, that was a lot of fun, and congratulations to Heather and Thomas. Thomas handled all the film work on all of 3 series of Scandal Makers. He also did all the editing, and This series, as the previous two series, were a lot of work. You're looking at a ton of research, the filming itself, getting to the location. So a lot goes into these little productions. And I want to thank Heather for all the hard work putting them together. I also want to thank the wonderful guests that we had on this series this year. We had Francois and Julie, both of whom you met today. What great presenters they were. Last year, we were fortunate to have 3 really good speakers as well, guest speakers. Anne Ledet, who you saw today in one of the productions. Kathy Curtis, who's here today with us. And Grant Myers, the president of QAHN, did the one on the witch. What a lot of fun all of these were. Now, you'll kick me if I forget to thank anyone, but I want to start by thanking, first and foremost, our great sponsor, which is the Department of Canadian Heritage. You can't do anything without money, and we're fortunate to have really good support from our federal funders. Uplands today, this beautiful venue. It's a lot of fun putting on events here. It's a small space, but it's a really good size for a live event like this. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your Sunday afternoon with us, both in person and online on Facebook. Glenn Patterson, of course, behind the camera today, our guy in master control, and Glenn's trusty assistant, Janice, here, who helped set things up. Who else have we got, Heather? You're going to kick me if I forget anyone. I think that's it. Yeah. Now, I want to say that if people here today like what we do as an organization, as a network, I'm talking about the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, I want to invite you to join our network. Come and see either Heather or myself after the event. And we'd love to have you. It's a great show of support to join the network. I also have 2 interesting little publications which I'm going to hold up, both quite popular. This one is called Meet the Network, brand new. It tells all about what we do. And this one, very apropos for today, Cemetery Heritage in Quebec, our bestseller, I think, going back many years, 10 years. So a lot of great tips on cemeteries and restoration in there. If you're interested, come and see me or Heather after. Anyway, thank you again. Thank you, especially Heather and our great guests from today. And thank you all for coming.